mind that last sentence, the one who showed him mercy. Sometimes mercy is interpreted as love, and so you might, and I think love is a better interpretation, and mercy, when we hear it in our modern ears, we think of something different. As I said to the youth, the sermon for today was hard for me because it could go in so many directions. It's such a rich text. We could spend a month on the Good Samaritan. We won't, although the next 2 Sundays and today, they speak to each other, these gospel lessons in ways that we're going to talk about. And the other thing that makes this story difficult, I think, is that most of us probably pretty familiar with the Good Samaritan, and we probably think that we have heard everything there is to hear about Good Samaritans, and we're surrounded by references to Good Samaritans in popular culture. There's a Seinfeld episode or two, for example, about Good Samaritans and the failure to be Good Samaritans. There's Good Samaritan laws. There's hospitals named Good Samaritan Hospital. So it's a fairly well-known story, and the danger, of course, with well-known stories is that we think that we know the whole story, and maybe there's parts of it we don't know. So let's see what we come up with. Today's parable, the most obvious part of it is it's a text about how we treat each other. What is it good to do? It's also a text about how not to treat each other, and it's interesting to read it in the context of the beginning of how this story comes into being. The man comes and asks questions. Not just any man, an expert in the law, which tells me, but it may not be fair of me, that he's asking questions. He already knew the answers to the questions. Maybe he does. Or maybe he just thinks that he does. And to be fair to this man, throughout the ministry of Jesus, Jesus is always getting the first question, right? What should I do to have eternal life? And the answer is always the same. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And we could spend a lot of time thinking about which parts of that are more difficult. Is it easier to love God with your heart, with your mind? Maybe it's easier to love our neighbors? No. I see some of you shaking your head. And it's much easier for many of us to love God than it is to love our neighbors for all sorts of reasons that we don't have to go into. So the expert in the law then has another question, right? Who's my neighbor? And he probably wants Jesus to settle the question once and for all. Who is our neighbor? Who deserves our love? Who do we have to treat well? What if my neighbor isn't deserving? What if my neighbor has the wrong beliefs or acts the wrong way or thinks that I have the wrong beliefs or thinks that I act the wrong way? What if the very existence of my neighbor feels wrong to me in all the reasons that people's very existence can feel wrong? And Jesus answers as he often does. He doesn't give a straightforward answer. It would be so nice if Jesus said, these 3 people are your neighbors, go and love them and everything will be fine. But no, Jesus gives us a story and we have to figure out what he's trying to mean. And some of the details, as is the way, have been lost to us in the 21st century, but the people who heard this parable would have, this story would ring some bells for them. Like the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho, which was famously dangerous, this road. It goes, New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine tells us it is a rocky road. It descends from 2,500 feet above sea level, a little higher than Asheville, say, down 825 feet lower. So it's rocky, it's treacherous, you're going down. And in the late 60s, the Romans paved it so that Rome could move troops efficiently to destroy Jerusalem. So people reading the Gospel of Luke, hearing the Gospel of Luke would be thinking of that too. This is a road that is dangerous for individual travelers, for civilizations, for the culture, for Jewish people. Now, that's not to say that we should blame the traveler. That might be our impulse, right? Why would this traveler be on this road anyway? If it's a bad road, you shouldn't go on that road. But you and I know. It would be nice if we could avoid all the dangerous roads in our lives, but we can't. And that doesn't mean we deserve to be beaten up and left for dead in a ditch. So, here we have our man in the ditch, and finally, help is arriving, except it doesn't. Jesus names the two travelers as a priest and a Levite. And we have probably heard this story enough that we, along with the listeners who first heard this parable, would say priest, Levite, people who have some power, people who have education, people who have authority, people who have respect. I've been thinking about what the modern equivalent would be if you were modernizing this parable. A doctor and a lawyer, maybe. A bishop and a seminary professor, maybe. A pastor and a teacher. I could go on and on, right? We could fill in the blank. But basically, these are people we would expect would stop and help. We might see it as hypocrisy when they don't stop and help. But, they might have good reasons for not stopping. Chief among them, that it might be a trap. This is how robbers often enticed people to stop, by pretending to be broken and bleeding in a ditch. Then someone comes over to help, and then, then you end up the one broken and bleeding in the ditch. You might have also heard that they couldn't stop because of purity codes. That's not exactly true either. Judaic law allows you to stop and ascertain if this body in the ditch is indeed a dead body or if it is a living body that needs help. So it's not a purity code question. And the priest really didn't need to worry about purity at that point because he's leaving Jerusalem, going to Jericho. He's off duty. He's off the clock. So he could have gotten ritually defiled if he needed to. It's not like he was going to need to report to the temple momentarily to do things and needed to be pure in that ritual purity element. No. Clearly, these people do not see themselves as obligated to stop. And so then we get to one of the more famous Samaritans of all time, this Good Samaritan. The other famous one is the Samaritan woman at the well. But let's talk about the Good Samaritan. And you probably remember that Samaritans are despised groups of people, very low on the social status pole. So people hearing this parable would not expect the Good Samaritan to stop. And what might our modern equivalent be? If you're lying broken and bleeding in the ditch, the hearers of Jesus' time would say, I don't want a Samaritan to stop. I don't want those people to help me. No, keep going. Or maybe they'd say, I'm happy for any help at all, even if it comes from someone who I think is low on the totem pole. When I'm broken and bleeding in the ditch, I need help. I'm not sure what the 21st century equivalent would be. Would that be a custodian? Would that be someone who's on their way back from working in the chicken processing plant? The Amazon delivery driver? The person who cooks the food at McDonald's? Anyway, this person that we might not expect to stop and help, stops to help. Goes the extra mile, in fact. Goes so many extra miles, finding wounds, going to the inn, paying for care, promising to return, and pay for more care if it's needed. The Samaritan goes above and beyond the call of duty, while the priest and the Levite ignore the call completely. In this gospel, it's easy to see the Good Samaritan as a Christ figure, the outsider who stops to help, who takes charge of the victimized, who would have been left to bleed to death otherwise, the one who finds care for the victim and pays for it. We could also see the man in the ditch as the Christ figure, ambushed, left for dead, but then rescued, cared for, brought back to life. And maybe it's because I'm doing an intense chaplaincy training this summer that this reading I noticed something that has rarely been emphasized in my reading. It's not only the Samaritan who restores the victim to life. The Samaritan starts the process of rescue and hands off the rest of the care to the innkeeper. In chaplaincy training, we've been focusing on self-care and care for others. We're encouraged to take a self-care break after treating each patient, and we're encouraged to do it after each encounter if possible. And we've spent time talking about what self-care looks like. And it's very different from any other professional setting I've ever been in, where you're supposed to take care of self-care on your own time, so that when you're on the clock for 8 hours, you're giving your boss above and beyond what you're being paid for, and then you can go and collapse somewhere else and do your self-care. But in chaplaincy training, we're reminded again and again that a chaplain, or in fact any member of the care team, can only do so much without burnout. Now, keep in mind, we're not allowed to say, okay, I've seen my one patient and now I have to go and for the next 7 hours of the day, I'll practice self-care over here in the garden. No, we practice some self-care, we get back and we go visit patients, practice some self-care, visit some patients. And I was reading an article by scholar Janine Stevenson Mosner, and she notes that the Good Samaritan knows how to practice self-care and care for others at the same time. She says, quote, "The Samaritan finishes his journey while meeting the need of a wounded and marginal person. He relied, in a sense, on the communal, on a type of teamwork as represented by the inn and by the host at the end." And then she goes on to talk about the types of care that the inn itself might represent. Maybe an AA meeting, maybe a round of chemotherapy, maybe the church itself is that inn where people get additional care. In other words, part of what this parable lifts up is that we can care for others, but we don't have to do it all ourselves. We don't have to be the sole provider. In fact, if we see ourselves as the only one who can provide care, we're on a path to burnout and despair, which we will see next week when we talk about Mary and Martha. Our world needs us to avoid burnout and despair. There are so many broken and bleeding bodies in the world's ditches. This parable is one of the most famous for a reason, a sad reason. We're in a world where we still have lots of broken and bleeding bodies, right? It's a parable where we still need to hear this lesson, right? There are people broken and bleeding in the ditch, and we need to go care for them. We are in a world where people are ambushed, countries are attacked. It feels like the whole world is broken and bleeding. Jesus answers the simple question of who is our neighbor, and he also answers the more thorny question, how to be a neighbor, how to love our neighbors. It's not by being judgmental and telling each other how we're failing morally and any of those other more negative ways we could be a neighbor. No, we are called to help as we are able, in all the ways that we are able, and to enlist others who will help. You may have heard that old news adage, if it bleeds, it leads. But all too often, we only hear about the bleeding. We don't hear about the ones who rescue. We hear about all the people who might be a threat to us, not the ones who are out there doing good in the world. The Good Samaritan may be one of the more famous parables, but it certainly doesn't influence news programming, which focuses on the ones doing the breaking, not the ones doing the bandaging. Happily, we too have an inn where we can bring our broken and bleeding attention spans. We can use our time here in this building, this church, to repair our souls. We can take spiritual practices with us out into the world to repair ourselves on a daily and an hourly basis. In her powerful novel, Father Melancholy's Daughter, Gail Godwin says that the opposite of sin is to heal what is split in the world, and that is the mission, our ultimate mission of humans, to heal what is split in the world. It might seem like the world is too far split apart to ever heal it, but Jesus insists over and over again that we can sow a seam of love and repair the fabric of life throughout all of creation.